Welcome to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast, where you can learn and be inspired by real-world examples of how technology is transforming businesses and reshaping industries in a language everyone can understand. Here is your host, Neil C. Hughes.
Welcome back to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast. Now, in previous years, digital transformation, believe it or not, was relegated to a corner of a department of an organisation. And that was largely fueled by a few factors, such as the changing and expanding IT buyers within an organisation, the rising digital fluency of businesses, not to mention the adoption of RPA and low-code and no-code solutions, and the transformation to cloud-native development techniques within an organisation too. And those four trends were driving a dramatic amount of transformation within organisations, which resulted in greater agility, productivity, revenue and profits for all those who were daring to embrace change. Now, for those who weren't, they actively started to get left behind. And that is happening in every industry everywhere around the world right now. So I've invited Rackspace Technology CTO Jeff DeVerter onto the podcast to join me in a discussion about the changing face of digital transformation and also share his story too. So buckle up and hold on tight as I beam your ears all the way to Texas so we can speak with Jeff about all this and much more. So a massive warm welcome to the show. Can you tell the listeners a little about who you are and what you do?
Sure. So glad to be here. Thanks so much for having me. My name is Jeff DeVerter, and I work for Rackspace Technology. And I'm vice president inside of the office of the CTO, and I'm the chief technology evangelist for the company. I've been with Rackspace, I started back in 2008. So I've seen quite a bit of change in this marketplace. It's pretty amazing.
You really have, and you've been working with cloud-based services and technologies for over a decade, and during that time, you've launched business units within companies, led those units, functioned as the CTO for Microsoft Technologies, and in general, been a trusted advisor to businesses large and small in making cloud transformation decisions. But before we go there, I'm curious, what is your origin story? Where did your love of technology come from, and what was it that put you on this path you're on today?
So completely date myself and tell you that as I went into computer science class as a senior, and I sat down and I looked at, a green screen, which is what we had at the time. And I thought to myself, I don't know if I could look at that green screen for the rest of my life. And I had sort of been dual tracking a technology-based music career, meaning engineering, production, that sort of stuff. And I actually went and did that for a good long while. And got to a point where I owned a recording studio out of Houston, Texas. And I thought, it'd be great to put a little computer network in here. This is the early 90s at this point. Yeah. And, computer networks weren't that fancy. And I sure had fun doing it. And I thought, if I ever decide to get out of the music thing, then I'll go back to this. Technology is fun. I love that. I love networking. I love making things work together and making people more productive. So it turned out that while I thoroughly enjoyed running a recording studio and producing albums and that sort of thing, the time commitment was growing, and I had a young family, and I thought, let's go back to tech. And so went through, got an MCSE through an interesting chain of events, ended up moving then to San Antonio and, leading a bunch of teams, really generally in and around the Microsoft technology base. This would have been Windows NT days and forward. I think even Exchange 5.5 was a part of that MCSE track. But over the next 5 or 6 or 7 years, I ended up stumbling into Microsoft tech we all know and love or hate called SharePoint, and really gravitated to that. And with that, that took me, like a lot of folks did in the early 2000s, a couple of years here, a couple of years there. And ended up working over at Rackspace, leading the team that was launching a SharePoint offering, what we call single tenant or dedicated SharePoint offering. The intent there is making an enterprise-grade SharePoint environment run for companies the world over, and helping to solve some of the hardest SharePoint problems for these organizations, sun up to sun up. And that was quite successful for us here at Rackspace. And And as you sort of mentioned before, that I went on to launch a bunch of other Microsoft-based technologies here and grow on. But that's really where it came from. So it's been a lot of fun, and I love getting to help companies with this transformation of how things have advanced. It was amazing back in the 2000s with what existed in tech, but of course that was effectively the Stone Age compared to what we get to work with today.
What a great story. And I love how you try to get out of technology. It almost sounded like that line in Godfather 3. Well, Pacino said, I think it was, just when I think I'm out, they pulled me back in.
That's exactly right. Well, and then I leave music to come do tech again.
Yeah.
And now, I've got this podcast and I help produce a few here at Rackspace as well. And here I am back in audio engineering and production. So it's all come for a full circle.
Love that. And you have been with Rackspace Technology for over 10 years now. Techies listening will know all about you, but for anyone outside of the tech space that might be tuning in today, can you just tell me a little bit more about the kind of problems you solve for businesses at Rackspace?
Sure. So in the early days, as I mentioned before, you had companies that had bought into the promise that SharePoint could make their lives a little easier. And what they found was, whether it was making the servers run or being productive with the tech, they weren't very successful. So it was ultimately where I get really excited about helping customers is, how do they use technology as a strategic differentiator in the business that they're in? How do they behave more productively? How are they more profitable? How do they limit expenses, which plays into that? And tech, even back in the SharePoint days, had the ability to make teams be more productive. And that just cascaded throughout the rest of the organization. But now when we think about things in a cloud context and the amazing tool chest that the hyperscale clouds bring to the table in capability, well, if it was confusing back in the SharePoint days, it's downright mind-numbing. In fact, one of the things that I've observed over the past decade or so that really keeps companies from being successful and making those first steps, even tentative steps, into this type of transformation is quite literally the fear of the unknown. What's it going to be like to transform from the way I do things today to the way things happen it could happen in the context of cloud? And then the other aspect is, how do you actually apply it? How do you envision a future? And really, what confuses the most of the time, Neil, is that you really have to say, okay, let's take tech off the table. What's hard? What's hard about your business? Or what opportunities exist that you haven't been able to really capitalize on? What's there that you wish you could do? And so we talk about that. We envision that. We paint that picture. And then technology sort of folds in line as the great enabler.
Love that. And I think in previous years, digital transformation was relegated to a corner of a department of an organization. So I'm curious, what do you think the key factors behind that were? I mean, obviously, recent events and a global pandemic changed all that, but what do you think the key factors behind it were before?
So it's funny you use the term digital transformation. When we first heard that, Neil, what was it, 7, 8, 9 years ago? And maybe not quite that far. But all of a sudden, the marketers came knocking on our door saying, digital transformation, let's do webinars, let's write white papers, let's tell the world about it. But when I peeled the marketing back and I looked at what was the tech making that happen, well, it really wasn't all that exciting. It was really just moving stuff from point A to point B. There really was no true transformation going on. So I had trouble back in those days, getting on board with the whole term. But with what's available now, well, I say digital transformation is 100% a reality. In fact, where I like to start the conversation is to talk about, let's transform your business. Now, digital is going to be a way that makes that happen, but let's transform your business. Again, looking at those challenges or looking at those opportunities and then thinking about how technology then fits behind it. So when you make the statement, before where you say it was sort of relegated to little areas. Well, it was regulated to areas because it was digital transformation really led with that first word, digital, meaning the IT team was coming knocking on departments' doors going, I think that if we virtualize your machines, just as an example, that we can be more efficient with the tech, and we can maybe even get to a point where we can deploy your apps faster. I mean, that was the heart of what digital transformation was in the beginning. So it was relegated to small sections because it was an activity driven by IT, not an activity driven by the business. Well, now the business is all wrapped up and in this whole concept, and they're reading the magazines, they're reading the articles, they're seeing what's happening in other areas, and they want a taste of that, and they want to get to a point where they're not manually entering in data. They want to see RPA dig into it. They want to see true enterprise search, because we've digitized so much over this past year and a half of the pandemic. Created quite an attack surface for the bad guys. But that's another whole conversation. But the world is ripe for true transformation because of the fact that we've all had to go home and work, and all of our activities got digitized. And now it's this amazing catalyst for us to now go in and look at this big pile of digital mayhem and go, now that's something that we can make something with.
And from the conversations you're having with customers, are there any other trends that are driving a dramatic amount of transformation out there right now?
Well, I mentioned RPA. It's the one I'm really banging that RPA, bell a lot these days, because it does several things for an organization. And the first that it does is it takes these, if anybody's not familiar truly with robotic process automation or RPA, what we're ultimately doing is we're creating these little bots, these little robots, not physical ones, but programs that run on top of, some enterprise software. Microsoft got it with their Power Apps. So you've got Automation Anywhere and several others. And what you do is you look for these repeatable, mundane processes that happen over and over. For instance, we're all familiar with the person down in finance, and they take, they receive those purchase orders or invoices in, they type them into a spreadsheet, they ultimately then get tracked there, and then they get typed into the financial software. And it's just a bunch of redundant typing and redundant activities. Whereas that's the kind of thing that a RPA bot actually just, can eat and do all day long. And now the person who was doing that in finance doesn't necessarily have to. But it goes farther than that, because now we can do this 24/7. We can scale that person effectively, infinitely. But what we also now get to do is that person who was processing that, while their activity lacked true value, I think, in the organization, in the grand scheme, in the long term, but where they do have amazing value is they know the business. They know the processes of the organization. And so that person now can go from being effectively an hourly employee with a couple of 3 months of training, be fluent in any of these applications, and be able to program these little graphical-oriented robots that get created by dragging things here and there. Because they know the business, they can know the processes. Now they're going to go to a very skilled IT worker inside of an organization, making on average what Gartner says is about $85,000 a year, and now have a pretty interesting career ahead of them. So it does lots of things. It makes the company more efficient. It allows them to scale better, and it allows them to truly use their people in effective ways that grow their careers. And I think that's pretty amazing.
And what do you think happens to these organizations that might stubbornly try and resist these trends like RPA that you mentioned there? Are they going to get left behind, or are they already being left behind?
No, they're already behind. They're already behind because they've got this opportunity, Neil, that, again, we spent the past year and a half digitizing everything so that we could all go home and work. Yeah. And it's already digitized now. And so that half the battle is won. If we were having this conversation 2 years ago, 6 months ahead of the pandemic happening, RPA existed then. All this other tech existed then. The cloud was in full bloom at this point, but we lacked one key ingredient, and that was a catalyst. And while nobody would ever, want to write a prescription and say, bring us a pandemic to force this, it does have the forcing function of, now that companies that adopt this level of digital transformation, they're the ones who win. We saw this amazing pace when we got into the pandemic, the pace of IT, the pace of change, and that's the new normal from pace. So if companies didn't actually pick up to that new pace, then they're behind, and the leaders are now outpacing that crazy pace. So it's they're absolutely being left behind in my estimation.
And there are a lot of buzzwords out there, especially around emerging technologies. And if we look at any articles around, let's say, artificial intelligence, there's a very binary viewpoint out there. They're either got Red Eyes and the Terminator robots that are going to take away all our jobs, or they're exaggerating the impacts of AI, and actually a lot of them are not even AI at all. But I'm curious, are there any myths or misconceptions that you read about on anything we've talked about today that we can just finally lay to rest once and for all?
Well, we didn't talk too much about, we get into AI and machine learning, and machine learning is just really a very advanced algorithm. And that algorithm is just meant to do, in a sense, we can extrapolate the example from RPA. Now, RPA takes on a small microcosm, this mundane, boring job, and does it with precision every day, all night, without complaint. And processes that information. But it does it against a rule set. When this comes in and it has these known fields, do these things. Now, what machine learning brings to the table is it says, okay, so we can do that stuff on a small scale well, but now here is this mountain of data. Let's make sense of that data. So, we use the term machine learning and AI sort of interchangeably, but if you go and talk to a data scientist, they despise the term artificial intelligence because there's no intelligence there. Intelligence brings to mind, a conscious thought as opposed to a rule set. And a rule set is what we have when we have a big pile of data. We have machine learning that looks for patterns and situations, and then based on a rule set, does a thing. For instance, think about 1 million photographs. And in those photographs, some small percentage might be, I'm going to use the example of, that I'd heard, it's a great one, of a deer. Because there's an example that gets used a lot of a data scientist and a hardware engineer was working with his school-age daughter, and they put in a garden, but the deer kept coming and eating the vegetables. And so they put a little camera out, and they created a machine learning model to recognize what a deer looked like. Now, thousands and thousands and thousands of pictures were being taken by this, but only when it would recognize the shape and the outline and the color of a deer would it actually blast a little horn and would scare the deer away. But that's a very good example of the fact that here's a mountain of data, and the data in the form of a bunch of pictures. And only when a condition is met does it take action. So I don't think we have the Terminator robots coming to steal our lives. But what I would say is this. I've given a couple of examples of how jobs in businesses are changing. Every single job in businesses is changing. And so my challenge then to all of the listeners, be you in IT or be you in anywhere else, is how are you adjusting and changing your job for the future? Because all of this mass digitization and digital transformation is changing our businesses, and it's creating opportunity, but it is mowing away and taking away those mundane jobs. So I would encourage everyone to figure out what's next.
Fantastic advice. I'm curious, what is it that excites you about that future that we're talking about today? And also, what role do you see Rackspace playing in that future?
So I get excited about everything. Well, you've sort of gotten it out of me already. This opportunity that exists to give people real value and a real career path inside of an organization. That data processor who was copying, invoice numbers now is creating, RPA robots and helping to automate and literally create potentially millions of dollars worth of savings for an organization, and now have a career where she's a salaried employee with benefits, with all of the things that you would expect that would come from that, a real career path, as opposed to somebody who's, copying invoice numbers. And so I think that's the kind of stuff that gets really exciting. So not everybody has the vision to know what's coming next in tech, but us tech leaders have it incumbent on us to help lead the rest of the organizations. So when we bring in a tech like RPA or something else, that we are looking for those folks inside of the organization who have a spark for learning, who have a spark for helping the company grow, as opposed to just wanting to be a swivel chair employee, copying from one system to the next. And if those are the folks that we need to pour into, we need training programs for our organizations, and organizations that are proactive about doing this sort of stuff are the ones that win in the end. And Rackspace's role in all of this is sort of leading the leaders inside of these organizations. Rackspace of old, when I started back in 2008, when we would talk to a customer, somebody who was coming to Rackspace, it was a very simple conversation. We would ask about their application and say, how much compute do you need? How much storage do you need? And how much network throughput do you need? Now, there were some details along the way, backup and recovery and virus protection and these sorts of things. But ultimately, that conversation could happen in the matter of a couple of hours or an afternoon, and off we were to serving that customer. But today, with everything that's literally infinitely available to us in tech today, from machine learning on down to everything else, the opportunities are huge. And so Rackspace has had to absolutely, I don't want to say reinvent ourselves, but we are continuing to morph so that we can lead companies down this road. So we can lead the leaders inside of these organizations to help them lead their companies in ways that will help them take advantage of the opportunities that exist, and also to fix the challenges that they've got inside of their organization. So Rackspace is very much now in the advisory and professional services space, thinking like your GSIs of old, except very much cloud focused, very much nimble. We're a huge organization, 7,200 employees the world over, on customers in 120 different countries around the world. And through all of that, whether they're small or large, it's conversations about how are you using this tech and what is ultimately is your desired business outcome. Remember, it's not just a conversation about compute, storage, and network anymore. It's what's your desired business outcome. We'll tell you what tech is the right to come along with that. In a lot of cases, we're going to help engineer and build that for you, but we're going to do it with you so that you're able to then manage it, you're able to then grow it, and you understand what that transformation look like and can start to own that in the future.
Excellent. And we did start our conversation today talking about your origin story. Now, this is usually the part of the podcast where I ask my guests if there was a particular song or piece of music that has inspired them in the past, helped them in their career, or just helps them get their head in the zone before a big meeting or going on stage. Now, because of your background there in the music industry, I'm quite curious where you're going to go with this. But is there a song and a story you could share?
Oh, that's a good one. So, I spend a lot of time, talking to customers. And so when I'm prepping a deck, usually I will go for something instrumental. And with my music background, you can imagine I'm also an instrumentalist. I play guitar and piano and a bunch of other things. But I will usually gravitate towards there's an acoustic guitar player. His name is Tommy Emmanuel. He's an artist out of Australia, and he's just amazing. And I'll usually put some sort of a mix of his on with Spotify. And when it gets to the end, Spotify does a great thing through machine learning that finds songs that are similar in nature, and we'll keep on. That's how I get in the zone usually.
Love it. And I always ask, when I ask that question to the guests on the podcast, I always choose one selection and add it to a Spotify playlist. So for anyone that's not heard of Tommy Emmanuel, what song should I put on that playlist that would introduce them to his work?
There's a song called Lewis and Clark, which is great. He does a lot of medleys of songs that you would know. There's a Beatles medley that's from live. There's a song called Sail On, which is pretty amazing. But he's been doing this for a number of years and has tons and tons of albums out. So you can't go wrong. Just go grab one and listen.
Cool. I'll add those to the playlist. And before I let you go, for anyone listening wants to find out more information about Rackspace, contact your team, or even tune into your podcast, what's the best way of doing that?
Sure. So the podcast that I have, it's called Cloud Talk, and it's available any of the places you find podcasts. You can also go over to rackspace.com/solve, SOLVE. That's our thought leadership practice that we have here at Rackspace. And then the podcast is a part of that, but you can find the podcast there as well. If you're super interested in the whole AI space, I produced one for one of our data scientist guys here, and that's called AI and You, Artificial Intelligence and You. So that's a good one. And then you can find me in the usual places, usually with the name J, or the character J, and then my last name DeVerter, DeVerter. So J DeVerter. So LinkedIn /in/DeVerter, J DeVerter. You'll find me there.
I'll add those links to the blog post that will accompany this episode. And I've loved chatting with you today. And one of the things that really stands out for me as an ex-IT guy that has seen what happens when business units go out and buy the latest tech first without looking for the problem first. I just love what you said there about you take tech off the table and understand what the problem is. And then you can understand what the best solution is. And more than anything, your story as well, such a rich story of your career in technology and your song choice, of course. But thank you for joining me and sharing your story with me today.
It was my pleasure, Neil. Thank you so much for having me on your podcast. It's definitely an honor. And I look forward to maybe speaking with you again in the future.
Now, although Jeff is passionate about technology, for me, what really shined today in our conversation is how he is fanatical about helping people and companies be more successful with technology. And what a great story he's had there. And I cannot thank him enough for taking the time to come on here and share it with us. But I'd love to hear your story, or if you know somebody that's got a great story in tech or anything, or if you've got a question or anything at all, please email me, techblogwriter@outlook.com. You can find over 1,600 episodes over on my website, techblogwriter.co.uk. Please keep those messages coming in. You guys and dolls are what makes this show what it is. But I've got to dash and record another interview today. So thank you for listening as always. And until next time, don't be a stranger.
Thank you for listening to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast with Neil C. Hughes. Remember, technology works best when it brings people together.